that we damaged ourselves and our relationship, what there is left of it with Moscow, by attacking these bombers on the tarmac or the runway as a result of the strategic arms limitation agreements.
So recently, Douglas Macgregor was on Andrew Napolitano's podcast talking about the recent Ukrainian, or let's be real about it, NATO drone strike on Russia's nuclear bombers. What effect does this have on the ground? Does it change the war situation at all? And what does it do to U.S.-Russian relations when ostensibly the Trump administration has open diplomatic arrangements with Putin? Let's take a look, let's watch, and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Did the United States and NATO attack Russia over the weekend using drones from their proxy, Ukraine?
Yes, unquestionably.
And how significant from a military perspective, Colonel, how significant was this attack? We're hearing stories that it was 40 to 50 planes that were destroyed, and we're hearing stories that it was 4 to 7 planes that were destroyed.
I think for the most part, it was a PR stunt to try and convey the impression that Ukraine is capable of carrying on the war, has great fight left in it, and is capable ultimately of harming Russia. I don't think the harm was very great. I think it's grossly exaggerated in the West. Anything you hear from the Western outlets, BBC, or any of the mainstream in the United States are probably untrue, or at least grossly exaggerated. What I think is true is that we damaged ourselves and our relationship, what there is left of it with Moscow, by attacking these bombers on the tarmac or the runway as a result of the strategic arms limitation agreements. And I think the Russians have reached a point now where collectively they all say we can't be trusted. Whatever we say is irrelevant because it's probably untrue. So I think that's the real fallout from this. We lost whatever lingering credibility we may have had with them for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, hard to disagree with them there. Like I said on a previous video, it's hard for me to believe that the U.S. wasn't at least knowledgeable about this strike, let alone may have directed it or guided it. We know from even corporate media reports that the U.S. guided this war and Ukraine's war in general from a base in Germany, much more than had been revealed prior. And that was released in a report in March. So he's right. Yeah, previously I had called this more of an embarrassment for Russia, but ultimately I do think it's a PR stunt, like he's saying. We've seen reports anywhere from 41 planes, and like the judge is saying 4 to 7. A lot of reports are saying 12 planes were damaged, and the number just keeps going down from the corporate media. So they're trying to move the goalpost, cling to the notion that this is significant, that Russia's on its heels, even though Russia still controls the Donbass. And the crazy thing about this too is that this strike violated the New START treaty that the U.S. had agreed to with Russia, which forced both the U.S. and Russian nuclear bombers to be out in the open. That's why they weren't under a protective coating. So in doing this strike, the U.S. had violated that agreement, clearly.
Well, you went right to where I was going to ask you about next. I mean, there are complaints this morning that President Zelensky did not tell President Trump, but surely senior officials in the CIA or the DIA, whichever intel group was involved in planning and carrying this out, must have known about it. Is it true that it took 18 months to plan and plot, the first year under the Biden folks and the final 6 months under Trump?
That's something I can't evaluate. I don't know. It may well be the case. Remember that Russia is an enormous country with thousands of miles of border. It's not hard to penetrate. And this was clearly an interesting and innovative way to attack, by using these trucks that with roofs that could be opened and then launch these drones. But we've seen this sort of thing before. The Russians have actually used containers on merchant ships to carry missiles that could be launched. I think there was something of a strategic failure on the intelligence side inside Russia. I don't know how that will be handled, but I'm sure that someone or some people will be held accountable for that.
Yeah, hard to disagree with them there. Actually, if it truly did take 18 months to plan this stunt, it makes it even harder for me to believe that the Trump administration or someone in the federal bureaucracy at high levels did not know about it. Again, let alone dictating it and guiding it and providing the intelligence for it, which is very likely. We know that Ukraine gets the majority of its military intelligence from the US, and that's why this is a proxy war in many regards. And if you're Russia looking at this and Trump out of one side of his mouth saying, hey, we want to end the fighting, we want to end the war, and then in the other side of his mouth, saying stuff like CNN did and Joe Biden did, that Russia wants all of Ukraine, Putin wants all of Ukraine. Like, how can they trust us when we continue to bankroll this war? And I say us loosely. I'm not complicit in the government treachery that's been ongoing in Ukraine, especially since 2014.
General Keane, who of course works for a think tank that is a friend for either the Defense Department or for Langley, is calling it a tremendous victory for the Ukrainians and a catastrophic defeat. This on Fox News where he works, and a catastrophic defeat for the Russians.
Yeah, I'm sure Putin's just about ready to surrender right now.
Claiming that the Ukrainians had engaged Russian drivers and Russian engineers, and all of this was assembled in Russia, and it's a catastrophic failure on the part of Russian intel. Do you think there's a little CIA exaggeration there?
No, I think so. I think the larger issue is not these sort of outrageous, nonsensical claims that are being made. And General Keene's an intelligent man; he knows the truth, but he's on the payroll, and he's rewarded richly in New York City as well as in Washington D.C. and the defense industries for pushing the conflict. We like to say that the so-called Democrats are all about refugees and open borders, and the so-called Republicans are all about endless war. In truth, they all fit together as one party, and General Keane is serving that interest. I think the larger question, though, is as follows. What is the likely impact of all of this on Russia? How are the Russians going to proceed from here? There are a lot of really angry people in Russia, Judge. I'm not talking about just officials. I'm talking about the population. And they have always been dissatisfied with the slow, ponderous, deliberate progress that the Russian armed forces have made in eastern Ukraine. And I think that this also reinforces in the minds of the delusional in Washington that how can the Russians pose any real threat to us? Look how long it's taken them to advance in eastern Ukraine. No understanding of the larger goals, no understanding of the larger objectives, one of which is to avoid war with us and NATO. The problem now for President Putin and his generals is you can't put up with this any longer. You've got to really push this to some sort of conclusion, or you risk this whole business escalating out of control because you don't know who you're dealing with. President Trump tweets things or sends out things on X, and he thinks because he says them, they're true. This is not my war. I didn't start this. I don't want it. Well, that's interesting, but it's irrelevant, President Trump. This is your war. You are the commander in chief. This is your responsibility. And that's the way the Russians look at it and everybody else. And he's beginning to look either feckless or downright reckless.
Yeah, I have to agree. Trump has not fulfilled his campaign promises to end this war in 24 hours, and that was pie-in-the-sky rhetoric. Many of us recognized it as such from then. But even some of Trump's skeptics actually thought this would be an area where he really would dig in his heels and try to end the war. But instead, outside of a very small period of a few days where he cut off aid to Zelensky, he's restored it and been complicit in attacks like this. So who can take the U.S. government seriously? I can't. But on the other hand, when it comes to a lot of the critics and even some of Trump's critics and Trump's supporters, people that weigh into this issue really actually over-exaggerate the likelihood for Ukraine to succeed. This has been historical. At the beginning, remember, we saw those stories in 2022 and 2023. Russia was running out of artillery. In the summer of 2023, the head of the Wagner group, or the Wagner group. I don't know how it's pronounced in Russia, but there was, this apparent coup for a while on Putin. Well, there was negotiations. There was no real talks that he got pardoned. He died later mysteriously, but then that wasn't the victory that Ukraine needed. And now they've switched the goalpost to it's taken Russia a long time to advance, but Russia's really held most of the Donbass for almost the entire war. There have been Ukrainian offensives into Russia. I think a big one was in either 2023 or the summer of 2024, one of the two. But that ground has been, swallowed back up mostly by Russia, who still controls about 90% of the Donbass. So the goalpost keeps changing, but what we know is the status quo goes on. People die. Conscription mandates get extended. You have U.S. complicity in funding the military-industrial complex and bloodshed there. And what needs to happen is what Macgregor said. The U.S. just needs to pull out resources. And all Trump's rhetoric about this being Biden's war won't stop what's actually happening. Only actions on Trump's part would stop the U.S. role in this and U.S. engagement in this theater.
What do you think the pressure is like on President Putin to respond dramatically? He has the Oreshniks. He has, God forbid he uses them, nuclear weapons. I get it that Russians are angry. These are Russians in the street. These are Russian elites. These are Russians in the intelligence community. These are Russians in the upper ranks of the military. And these are Russians that advise him every day.
President Troopin, what am I saying? Troopin, that's a new one. President Putin, if anything, is not emotional. That doesn't mean he doesn't feel anything, but he's a man who learned early on how to manage and control his emotions. No doubt he shares the anger of his population. Absolutely. But he's not a Trump-like figure. This is not someone who beats his chest in public and is anxious to announce his immediate intentions. I think what is happening right now is that they have an enormous number, over 700,000 troops in Ukraine right now. They have additional forces in Belarusia and inside the Russian borders. What he's doing at this point is he's looking at the map, he's listening to his commanders, and he is concluding that they have to press west. In other words, to Dnipro, which is on the Dnieper River, also to Kherson, and then ultimately down into Odessa. I think, if anything, these events, these PR stunts with explosives, either in Siberia on these airfields or with the bridge to Crimea, which, contrary to popular belief, is no longer as vital and essential as it once was, but it's still symbolic. Nevertheless, I think he's reached the point now where he understands they're going to have to press to those areas. And I think that will be his response. He's not going to announce it in a big way, but over the next week or two, I think you're going to see major troop movements. And there's not a damn thing that the Ukrainians can do about it.
Yeah, I really agree with Macgregor on this one. Zelensky had an excellent opportunity in Istanbul to keep all the Donbass provinces despite violating the Minsk Accords, but he threw that out when Boris Johnson and probably the U.S. State Department or the U.S. military-industrial complex convinced him otherwise. And then, just before this attack, Zelensky had the opportunity to keep probably that ground too. But now I think we're in a situation where Putin and Russia might respond by pushing all the way to Odessa and getting Odessa too, which again wasn't even on the table of Russian claims that they had in Istanbul, where they didn't claim to want any of the Donbass and that would have returned to Ukraine, or now. But now that might be a reality. That might be Russia's next step. And the more and more these PR stunts and, infusion of cash into Ukraine to keep this war going, the more ground Russia is likely to get ultimately when all of this is said and done.
Does the nature of this attack, with the drones being smuggled into Russia and set off from within Russia, bear the earmarks of Mossad? Does it remind you of the exploding pagers?
Well, keep in mind that there are many Mossad agents inside Ukraine. They've been involved for some time now. Reports came in early on within the first couple of years of Mossad officers who spoke perfect Ukrainian, fluent Ukrainian, in Ukrainian uniform, directing operations, running replacement operations, and so forth. So they've been involved from the beginning. And keep in mind that the CIA, and MI6 in Great Britain and Mossad are all joined at the hip. After all, their cooperation made possible the removal of Assad. Obviously, the Turkish president Erdogan had the critical role to play because he had most of the power in Syria. But nevertheless, they were instrumental, and now they're instrumental in integrating the former ISIS and Al Qaeda elements into this new permanent Syrian army. So they're all over. They're involved. If you begin asking, well, how much were they involved? Then we're in the game of speculation.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's well known that the Israeli lobby and the Mossad does support U.S. involvement in Ukraine. They ostensibly say it's for democracy, which doesn't exist in Ukraine. I mean, he basically ended the Orthodox Russian churches. He ended, political oppositions, completely dismantled oppositional media, and wants to expand conscription, enacted martial law. So democracy doesn't exist there, but they do ostensibly support it, I think, because they want to take the eyes of the world off of what Israel's doing in Gaza. And this is the biggest theater of war in the world going on right now. It's to Israel's advantage to keep people talking about this rather than what they're doing, bloody so, in Gaza.
I have no idea, but they're involved.
But is it understood from your perspective that CIA, MI6, Mossad, and I forget the initials, forgive me, the Ukrainian intel work together?
Yes, SBU, which is or the initials that you're talking about, they're very definitely not just integrated, they're heavily dependent upon it. I mean, again, who's going to provide them with the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities and the resulting intelligence that flows from that? Well, we're the principal source. This is the problem with President Trump standing up there and saying, I don't want this, and I've tried to end it, and I don't want any part of this. Well, that's fine, Mr. President, but you're ultimately responsible for all of it now. And no one is going to believe anything you say unless you act decisively to disengage from this. And thus far, we found out that President Trump isn't willing to do anything to fundamentally change what Biden and his administration did.
Yeah, I have to agree. The Trump honeymoon is over. We're not 30 days into his presidency. We're, almost 6 months into it? We're 5 months into it now? So, Trump's inherited this war, and he mostly is carried out outside of opening diplomatic relations with Russia, which is good. Outside of that, he has essentially maintained the Biden status quo of the war. Will he go to Congress and ask for more money? I sure hope not. Aaron Matei doesn't think so. I hope to heavens that Aaron is right about that one.
I'm just wondering now, if the CIA's involvement was integral, wouldn't they have had an obligation to, under the law, get a presidential finding before they could do this? Stated differently, did Donald Trump know about this ahead of time?
Well, in theory, you're right. And there may be a finding left over from the previous president that they'll refer to. As far as President Trump is concerned, this is not someone who is detail oriented. This is not someone who sits down and studies reports. This is not someone who sits through lengthy briefings and asks hard questions. We had this recent incident where 4 American soldiers were returned. Their remains were returned to the United States from Lithuania. The Lithuanians provided them with almost a state funeral. They arrived at Dover Air Force Base, and there was no president of the United States to greet them. Now, technically, he doesn't have to be there. And he sent Mr. Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense, to go receive these. But people remember vividly Ronald Reagan receiving these bodies after the Beirut bombing. That has been imprinted on the American mind like nothing else. And there was an expectation that the loss of these men's lives would be noted publicly by the president in a dramatic way. It didn't happen. Instead, he went to a golfing tournament sponsored by the Saudis. I don't think there's a lot of self-awareness with President Trump. I don't think he grasps the dangers that are involved. And so the only thing I can tell you is that he may well not have known, and he may have simply waved it off and said, yeah, that's fine, whatever, and gone on with the rest of his day. That sounds callous, but I don't think it's unrealistic.
And I wonder what.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I actually do think it's possible that Trump himself was not even aware of this, but I don't believe that no one in the U.S. intelligence apparatus and deep state was aware of this and probably guided it, by the way. Because, we know that Trump isn't detail-oriented, as Macgregor said, and who knows how significant this would be perceived. But what I do know is that if Trump was aware of this, and Russia finds out through their own intelligence that Trump was aware of this, and authorized it, and guided it even, he is not going to talk to Trump's men, and that is the biggest fear imaginable. He might not ever take Trump's diplomats seriously again. Rubio and Witkoff, it's hard to take Rubio seriously in the first place, but that might alienate their relationship completely. That's my biggest fear.
Happens when he and President Putin speak again. Hey, Donald, your guys tried to destroy a good chunk of my military, and you didn't know about it? Come on.
I think President Putin will be, as always, polite, but pay absolutely no attention to anything President Trump says. Remember, I'm trying to turn Putin into Trupin again. Yeah. President Putin has said on more than one occasion that he's dealt with several presidents, Judge.
Right.
And he discovered that it really didn't make a great deal of difference what they said or what they insisted were their intentions, that ultimately there was another power in Washington. And that power was making the decisions. And so the presidents themselves didn't turn out to be very influential. In Russia, the president of Russia has enormous power and authority. And if he says something, it happens. If he says it's not going to happen, it won't. So for the Russians right now, this whole business is hard to grasp. And they'll continue to be polite because that's their nature. But they're going to press on and do whatever they think they have to secure their borders and their country.
That is so true. U.S. policy in Eastern Europe and U.S. policy toward NATO has maintained the status quo since essentially the mid-90s, since the Clinton administration determined that, eventually NATO will include Ukraine. At the Budapest summit in 2008, I believe, Bush repeated this, might have been 2009, and said NATO will be part of Ukraine. Obama wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO as well. And we know that certainly Biden wanted that too. It hasn't really changed regardless of the presidential occupant at the time, and I hate to say even including Trump, who so many people characterize as being anti-establishment, but still the establishment policy seems to be carried out. Douglas Macgregor was drinking in this interview from a mug that said Trump won, but I got to tell you, I don't think he's won in Ukraine. I think he's playing an incredibly losing hand in Ukraine by continuing to fund it, being complicit in attacks like this, and raising his rhetoric to being indistinguishable from CNN, like I said earlier, at times recently. Putin is not going to respect the potential for peace talks if the U.S. continues to launch and be involved in offensives such as this. The only solution, it's an America First solution that a lot of people don't want to admit, even among Trump supporters, is to disengage entirely from Ukraine, bring all the resources out of there, all the special forces out of there, military intelligence, stop funding the madness. They will have to agree with peace. To a peace at that point, and Europe should be much more involved than the United States in this regard. This is thousands and thousands of miles away. It's not our fight. But I do want to hear from you guys. What do you think are the ramifications politically of this recent attack? Let me know in the comments down below. And do you agree with Douglas Macgregor? Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.